So we are currently in week 6, and which deals with chapter 6 of your textbook, and that is economic inequality, wealth, and poverty. The learning objectives for this week are to describe the extent of economic inequality, wealth, and poverty around the world, to summarize ways of defining and measuring poverty, and to discuss criticism of the U.S. poverty line, to analyze how the structural functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interactionist perspectives view the nature, causes, and consequences of economic inequality, wealth, and/or poverty, to describe the extent of economic inequality and poverty in the United States, and discuss patterns that characterize the wealthy 1% as well as patterns of poverty, to explain how economic inequality and poverty affect health and hunger, housing and homelessness, legal and political inequality, war and social conflict, vulnerability to natural disasters, education, marriage opportunity and family problems, and intergenerational poverty, to discuss international and U.S. strategies aimed to reduce poverty and economic inequality, to identify and describe various U.S. public assistance and welfare programs, and discuss at least 4 myths about welfare in the United States, and finally to understand the implications of blaming poverty on the poor and explain why alleviating poverty and reducing economic inequality are worthy goals. Your assignments are to read the chapter, to watch this video that I am recording. So here's the chapter. You will find the video right under the chapter, the pre-recorded video, and you'll also find the lecture quiz under that video, which I'm recording now, so I will be posting after. As far as the assignment, your written assignment has to do with independent living. I'm not going to go over it right now because I'm going to go over it during our live lecture meeting. But this is week 6, so make sure you familiarize yourself with this week. So before we start on the PowerPoint presentation, I want to show 2 short videos that kind of give an introduction to income inequality and social class and poverty, and it kind of gives you a base knowledge of what you should know before this PowerPoint presentation. So let me start off with this video first.
Last week, we introduced Max Weber's 3 dimensions of social stratification: economic class, social status, and power. But how do those 3 things actually interact in the real world? What does social stratification look like in the here and now? Or I guess I should say, what does stratification look like in the United States right now? For all the non-Americans watching, don't you worry, we will be getting to stratification around the world later. But for today, we're going to focus on the United States and how social inequality plays out here. Do we live up to the ideals that Jefferson laid out in the Declaration of Independence? Are all men created equal? Spoiler alert, sociology says not so much. When you hear people talking about inequality in the US, chances are they're talking specifically about income inequality or wealth inequality. So let's start there. First, we're going to split the US into 5 even groups, 20% of the population in each. These are what social scientists call quintiles. As of 2015, households in the US that make less than $22,800 a year are the bottom quintile of the income distribution. The exact middle of the distribution, or the median of household income, was about $56,000 a year. And the top quintile, that's every household making over $117,000 a year. Now, the simple fact that these quintiles have different incomes tells us that we don't have a perfectly equal society. Perfect equality would mean the same income for everyone. So there's clearly some income stratification in the US, but how much? The households in the top quintile earn about 50% of all the income in the United States, and about 20% of all income is earned by the top 5% alone. In the bottom quintile, these households earn only 3.4% of the total income in the US. Those are pretty huge differences, and they get even bigger when we talk about wealth. First things first, wealth is not the same thing as income. Income is the money you earn from work or investments, whereas wealth is the total value of the money and other assets you hold, like real estate and stocks and bonds. For the bottom quintile, average household wealth levels are negative. That's because part of wealth is debt. So if you have more debt than positive assets, your wealth is negative. So we've got an average net worth of about negative $6,000 for the bottom quintile and a median household wealth level of about $68,000. Any guesses what the top might look like? Well, the top quintile's household income was about twice the median income, so maybe a good guess would be about, $140,000 for wealth? Wrong. The average net worth for those in the top quintile is 9 times that of the median, $630,000. And that's not even close to the wealth levels for the top 1%. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the cutoff for entering the top 1% of the wealth distribution is $2.4 million. Wealth levels also tend to vary by demographic group. For example, women tend to have lower individual wealth levels than men. Married couples accumulate more wealth than people who are unmarried. And race and wealth are closely linked. The median wealth level of a white household is about 12 times that of a black household. One of the main sources of wealth for Americans is homeownership. White Americans are much more likely to own houses than black Americans, and the neighborhoods that white Americans live in tend to be wealthier, even if you control for income. Patrick Sharkey, an American sociologist who researches neighborhoods and wealth, found that black families making $100,000 a year live in the types of neighborhoods that a white family making only $30,000 would live in. So where are these gaps coming from? Well, for one thing, a lot of wealth is passed on through generations. Let's go to the thought bubble to talk about redlining, a practice from the not-so-distant past that has made it harder for African American families to accumulate and pass on wealth. In the 1930s, the government founded the Federal Housing Agency, an office set up to regulate mortgages and interest rates to guard against the types of foreclosures that happened during the Great Depression. The FHA began insuring mortgages, and since these mortgages were backed by the government, they made getting a house less risky and easier for many Americans. Which is great, except they didn't make it easier for all Americans. The big banks that issued the loans engaged in a practice called redlining, in which they'd literally draw a red line on a map around neighborhoods that they deemed too risky to invest in. If your house fell within that red line, the banks wouldn't give you a loan. And the neighborhoods that got redlined were the ones where minorities, particularly black families, lived. Redlining was outlawed in 1968, but because homeownership is the major source of wealth for most Americans, neighborhood segregation and racial wealth inequalities are the legacies of policies like redlining. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Okay, so on the money front, the U.S. isn't looking all that equal. And money, particularly wealth, doesn't just influence economic class. It's also a form of power, including political power. A 2014 study by American political scientists Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page looked at the relationship between the political views of those at the top of the income distribution and the laws that are actually passed. They found that the views of those at the top have a significant positive relationship with laws getting passed, while the views of people at the middle of the income distribution have pretty much zero correlation with what laws actually get passed. But remember, correlation doesn't mean causation. The study doesn't tell us why higher income is related to more political influence. The economic elite's influence could come through donations to political candidates, but higher income is also correlated with higher education levels, and more highly educated people tend to be more civically active, too. Now, there are many factors besides income and wealth that influence social stratification in the U.S. For example, there's occupation. If you're an adult, probably the first question that people ask you is, what do you do? That's because the jobs we do and what other people think of those jobs are a major part of our socioeconomic status. You probably have opinions about what jobs are cool, what jobs are impressive, and what jobs you'd never work at. Those kinds of opinions are what the National Opinion Research Center, a think tank at the University of Chicago, was interested in when they created a ranking of occupational prestige. Top of the list? Surgeons, college presidents, lawyers, nuclear physicists, astronauts. Smack dab in the middle are jobs like purchasing managers, office supervisors, IT technicians, private detectives. That's right, all you office managers out there, you are just as cool as Veronica Mars. And the bottom of the list are jobs like busboys, parking lot attendants, and telephone solicitors. You might notice there's some similarities in the types of jobs in each category. For one thing, jobs with occupational prestige typically pay pretty well. We have overlapping spheres of stratification here. You get social and financial benefits from being a lawyer. Busboy, not so much. The other thing you might notice is that all 5 of the most prestigious jobs require an advanced degree, and not just a college degree. People in those jobs typically have some sort of post-grad education as well. The jobs at the bottom of the prestige scale, however, don't require a college degree, and many don't even require a high school diploma. So the kind of education you have ends up being pretty important for where you end up in terms of social status. Most American adults have a high school diploma, about 88% as of 2015, but only 33% of Americans over the age of 25 have a bachelor's degree, and even fewer, 12%, have an advanced degree. And the issue of who goes to college is strongly related to your socioeconomic background. For kids born in the 80s, 54% of those born in the top fourth of the income distribution have a 4-year college degree. For those born in the bottom fourth, only 9% do. As with wealth inequality, race and ethnicity are also linked with educational attainment. 22% of African Americans and 16% of Hispanic Americans have a 4-year degree, compared to 36% of non-Hispanic white Americans and 53% of Asian Americans. Now, so far, all I've done is give you a bunch of descriptions descriptive data about income, occupations, and education in the United States that shows you that yes, there is inequality in the United States. But how should we think about inequality? Is it good or bad? You can argue that inequality isn't, in and of itself, a bad thing. Some jobs are harder than others. Doctors take on many years of education so that they can save lives, and I'm perfectly fine with heart surgeons getting paid more than I am. And it's probably good to live in a society where working hard and learning skills that benefit other people is encouraged. This is the idea of meritocracy, or social stratification based on personal merit. The US is partially a meritocracy. Social position does, to some extent, reflect individual talent and effort. But a lot of socioeconomic status is also due to something outside of your control. The status you're born into. If you start out on the bottom of the ladder, the likelihood that you'll get to the top is low. The environment you're in during the early years of your life shapes your ability to succeed as an adult. There's a large body of research that suggests that kids born in low-income families start school behind their peers, and those gaps only get wider as kids get older. Inequalities in one generation are often reproduced in the next generation. And as we've noted throughout this course, race and gender are closely linked to social status. There are lots of factors that play into these inequalities across groups. Differences in education levels, differences in family composition, differences in occupation choice. Understanding why we see these inequalities across demographic groups is one of the foundational questions of sociology. And that's something we'll be exploring more in later episodes. Today, however, we talked about 5 ways that social stratification plays out in the US. Income inequality, wealth inequality, political power, occupational prestige, and educational attainment. We discussed descriptive data about inequality in the US and how it varies across race and gender. And finally, we talked about the relative role of merit in determining your socioeconomic status. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana.
So now I'm just going to get straight into the next video because it's kind of a continuous. So let me get this up.
Social class in America can be hard to talk about, and not just because you may find it awkward to discuss who's poor and who's rich, or who has more power and who has less. As sociologists, the difficulty for us is in pinning down exactly what we mean by social class. There isn't just one definition of it, and the definition you use will depend on what society you're interested in. If we go by Marx's definition, we have 2 classes: the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the proletariat, who do the labor. But this might be too simplistic for our world. If you own a small store and you work there, which category do you belong in? Your day-to-day life probably looks more like that of a retail employee than that of a CEO, but Marx would put you in the bourgeoisie because you own a business and hire workers. So let's try another definition, one that's more in the tradition of our old friend Max Weber. His theories were more about what kinds of opportunities a person's class gives them. The owner of a big company has different opportunities than the owner of a small shop, but they'll both have different resources available to them than someone who manages an office or somebody who works at a factory. So in this case, a social class can be defined as a group that's fairly similar in terms of income, education, power, and prestige in society. And we can use this definition to better understand the social classes that make up society in the United States, and it can help us to answer some of the questions they raise. Like, is there more than one kind of upper class? How can the middle class fit everyone who thinks they belong in it? And what does poverty in America really look like? Broadly speaking, American society can be split into 5 social classes: upper class, upper middle class, average middle class, working class, and lower class. The upper class consists essentially of the capitalists in Marx's system. This is the top of the income and wealth distribution, those who earn at least $250,000 a year and control much of the country's wealth. And as we learned last week, money talks. This group tends to wield a lot of political and social power. But within the upper class, there are subclasses that distinguish by and large between old money and new money. The upper class includes those who derive their wealth from inheritance rather than work. People in this class may have jobs, but usually they take on more honorary positions, such as board members or heading up philanthropic organizations. But there's also a large part of the upper class whose wealth came from work. Most of those that we think of as wealthy, the Bill Gates, Oprah Winfreys, and Kanye Wests of the world, fall into this group. After upper class comes the middle class. Remember a while back when we talked about how almost every American thinks that they're middle class? That's way too many people to fit into the middle, which is why sociologists split the mid-range of the income distribution into 3 groups. Upper middle class families typically have incomes between $115,000 and $250,000 per year and make up about 15% of income earners. About 2/3 of the adults here have college degrees, and many have postgraduate degrees. It's almost a given that their kids will attend college when they grow up. Adults in this sector tend to have jobs that are considered prestigious: doctors, lawyers, engineers, and the like. Their families typically own homes in good school districts and are able to afford luxuries like travel and multiple vehicles. And it may not surprise you to learn that they're wealthy, at least compared to most Americans. This group is likely to have wealth from their home, strong 401ks, and financial investments. Now, families in the so-called average middle class make between $50,000 and $115,000 and make up about 35% of income earners. Keep in mind, the median family income in the U.S. is $70,700. So families in this group still tend to own their own homes, but the mortgages might be more cumbersome. And they have some wealth, usually tied up in their home or a modest retirement savings account. About half of this group is college educated, though they're more likely to have attended public universities than private schools. And average middle-class jobs are typically so-called white-collar jobs. Think office workers, teachers, and middle managers. In contrast, most blue-collar workers, or those whose work is primarily based in manual labor, fall in the lower middle class. About 30% of Americans are in this category, with incomes ranging from about $25,000 to $50,000 a year. Lower middle class families are less likely to own their own homes and typically hold little to no wealth. The most defining feature of this social class is the type of jobs that are associated with it, namely manual labor, which is why it's often referred to as the working class. Factory work, construction, manufacturing, maintenance work, all of these jobs generally fall under working class occupations, and while some working class jobs require technical skills, they don't usually require a college education. It's important to note that working class jobs are more sensitive to how the economy is doing, because these jobs tend to be built around making stuff. When a recession hits, factories need fewer workers to meet demands, or the plant's owners might decide that it's cheaper to use machines rather than workers to produce their goods. And just as vulnerable to economic downturns, if not more so, is the lower class. Lower class Americans are blue-collar workers at the bottom of the income distribution. They make less than $25,000 a year and tend to work hourly jobs that are part-time with unpredictable schedules and no benefits, like health insurance or pensions. About 20% of Americans, or the bottom quintile, fall into this group. The majority of these families don't own their own homes and are more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher rates of poverty, lower quality school districts, and higher crime rates. In contrast to an upper middle class family whose children are likely to go to college, only 9% of the children born in the bottom income quartile complete a 4-year college degree. And the lower class also includes many Americans who are living in poverty. The U.S. government sets an income benchmark called the federal poverty level, a threshold that's used in part to determine who's eligible for public assistance programs like food stamps or help with health care. As of 2017, the federal poverty level for a family of 4 is $24,600, and 13.5% of Americans live in households below that. The government arrives at this figure by estimating the minimum annual pre-tax income that's needed to pay food, shelter, transportation, and clothing costs for a given household size. Of course, what's poor in the United States won't be the same as in another country. The U.S. federal poverty line is a measure of relative poverty, based on a standard of living in the U.S. Relative poverty is used to describe a lack of resources compared to others who have more, but absolute poverty is a lack of resources that threatens your ability to survive. The federal poverty level gives us an indicator for which Americans have the fewest resources and lets us examine trends in groups that are the most economically vulnerable. For example, groups that can't work, like children, the severely disabled, and the frail elderly, are particularly vulnerable to poverty. But many working Americans are vulnerable to poverty too. 12% of working-age adults in poverty work full-time, and another 29% work part-time. These are the working poor. You can see how it's quite possible to work full-time and still live in poverty when you do the math. The federal minimum wage in the United States is $7.25 per hour. A 40-hour work week for 50 weeks a year would net an income of $14,500, which is well below the poverty line for a family of 4. It's hard enough to pull yourself out of poverty on a low-wage income, which is partly why more than half of families in poverty are headed by single mothers. Higher rates of poverty among women, known as the feminization of poverty, is related to the increasing number of women who are raising children on their own and who work low-wage jobs. But in addition to gender, you can also look at poverty by race. Contrary to popular belief, most poor Americans are not black. In fact, 2/3 of the poor in the U.S. are white. Black Americans are, however, more likely to be poor than white Americans. 24.1% of black Americans, who make up about 13% of the total American population, were living in poverty in 2015. Compare that to 11.6% of white Americans, who make up about 77% of the total population. Now, the causes of poverty are many, and it's not easy to understand why some groups are more vulnerable than others. America likes to think of itself as a nation that values self-reliance, where anyone can succeed. And this view is partly why some argue that poverty is the result of an individual's own failings, or of certain cultural attitudes. One of the most famous proponents of this idea was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, former U.S. Senator, ambassador to the United Nations, and, by trade, a sociologist. A report he wrote while Secretary of Labor in the Kennedy administration, known as the Moynihan Report, blamed high rates of poverty among African Americans not on a lack of economic opportunity, but on cultural factors in the Black community, like high rates of birth outside of marriage. By contrast, American sociologist William Julius Wilson, who you might remember from episode 7, has provided a counter to this idea. Wilson has documented how Black Americans are much more likely to face institutional barriers to achieving economic success, and are more likely to live in areas where jobs are scarce. He argues that in order to understand poverty, we have to look at wider economic and social structures, as well as the history and culture of racism in the US. Next week, we'll talk more about how social class structures affect how Americans live their lives. But for now, you learned about the 5 different social classes in the United States: the upper class, the upper middle class, the average middle class, the working class, and the lower class. And we discussed what poverty looks like in the United States. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio.
So I'm going to go straight into the PowerPoint because within the PowerPoint there's going to be discussion about everything that she spoke about. So like I said, chapter 6, and it deals with economic inequality, wealth, and poverty. So this is a quote by Nelson Mandela: "Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity, it is an act of justice." I'm not going to go over the learning objectives because I went over them at the beginning of this video, but here they are again within the PowerPoint. This is the chapter outline, which is also the outline for the PowerPoint. So first we're going to discuss the global context. Then we're going to define and measure poverty. Then we're going to look at the sociological theories. Then we're going to move on to economic inequality, wealth, and poverty in the United States. Then we'll move on to the consequences of economic inequality and poverty. Then we'll talk about the strategies for action, the safety nets, and understanding economic inequality, wealth, and poverty. So first we need to define wealth, which she did in the video, and it refers to the total assets of an individual or household minus liabilities. And liabilities are mortgages, loans, and debts. So this is basically if you own property, if what you have in your bank account, and then what they do is that if you have a loan out or you still owe money on that property, they deduct that from your total amount of what you own, and then that's what your wealth is. So for example, let's say I own a house that's $500,000 and I have a mortgage of $200,000, meaning that I owe $200,000 of my $500,000 house. And let's say I have $100,000 in my account saved. My total wealth would be the $500,000 minus $200,000 because I owe that in the mortgage. So now that leaves me with $300,000. But then I have $100,000 in the account, on my bank account saved. So now I have $400,000. So that would be my total wealth. So the richest 1% of adults ages 20 and older in the world own more wealth than the bottom 99%, or the rest of the population combined. And the poorest half of the world adult population owns barely 1% of the global wealth. So this is defining the different types of poverty. There's absolute poverty, which is the lack of resources necessary for material well-being, such as food, water, housing, land, and healthcare. So that would be people living like in poverty in the United States. Then there's relative poverty, which refers to a deficiency in material and economic resources compared with some other population. So that's when you compare different poverties, like if you were to compare US poverty with India poverty, or even within neighborhoods in the United States, and you talk about the relative poverty. And then finally, it's extreme poverty, which is living on less than $1.90 a day. This is an example of extreme poverty. People in this tented village in New Delhi, India. So you see how extreme poverty is different than absolute poverty. So defining and measuring poverty. Low income is only one indicator of impoverishment. The Multidimensional Poverty Index is a measure of serious deprivation in the dimensions of health, education, and living standards that combines the number of deprived and the intensity of their deprivation. About 1.5 billion people in the world are multidimensionally poor. So, before reading about how poverty is measured in the US, answer these questions. And I know that you can answer because this is pre recorded, so I'm going to answer for you. But how much annual income do you think a household with one adult needs to earn to avoid living in poverty? And the next question is, what about a household of two adults, one adult and one child, or two adults and one child? So let's think about the first one. The first one I would say, let's say you lived in Miami. How much money do you think you need to make so you don't live in poverty in Miami? I would guess $20,000 for one person, and that's cutting it, living tight. As far as a family of two, whether it's two adults or one parent and one child, or two adults and one child, I would imagine that if somebody has a family of, let's say it's two adults and one child, we're looking at, so they don't live in poverty, I would imagine that it would be at least $35,000 a year. And again, we're talking about here in Miami. So now I'm going to show you what the government says. So the government says here that if you're under the age of 65 and you have no children, if you make $13,300 or less, you're living in poverty. And if you're 65 and older, if you're making $12,261 or less, you're living in poverty. So let's just look at that example real quick. So you're living single in Miami and you're making $13,000 a year. Do you think that you're going to be able to rent an apartment, let alone buy food, buy health insurance, gas, your car payments? We're thinking about all the different types of payments and responsibilities you're going to have by living alone. So at $13,300, finding an apartment in Miami, we'll say, and let's call it cheap. Let's call it $1,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment, which, if any of you know, is hard to find in Miami. So if I were to multiply that 1,000 times 12 months, because there's 12 months in a year, that's $12,000 that I'm already out of the $13,300 that I'm making that is going straight to my rent. So that leaves me now with $1,300. $1,300 is basically leaving me with a little less than $110 a month for the rest of the year to survive. So as you can see, this poverty threshold that the government lays out is a little bit incorrect when you think about it, because imagine if you lived in New York City making $13,000 a year. You couldn't even find an apartment. So let's look at the families. So let's look at a family of four. And we'll say it's two adults and two children. They're saying that a family of four, if they're making $25,000, $926, $25,926 dollars a year, or less, they're in poverty. Now, I think it's safe to say that if a married couple with two children living anywhere at making $25,000 a year is obviously living in poverty. But don't you think that even if they were making $35,000 a year, they would still be living in poverty? We're talking about expenses for kids. We're talking about two grown adults. We're talking about food. We're talking about everything that you need to come to survive. And here what I'm trying to show is that the government really puts these low numbers that, yes, of course, anybody making any of these numbers on here in any of these scenarios is for sure living in poverty. But I would argue that a person living alone making 20 grand, not even 13, 20 grand is going to be living in poverty. And I would argue that a family of four with two kids making $35,000 a year is living in poverty. So, this just goes to show how the numbers that the government come up with, and later on in the slides, I'm going to show you how how they come up with that number, is not really the reality of the situation that we live in. Because there's not many places in the United States where a family of four can live for $35,000 a year and not be living in poverty. So let's go into some of these facts here I want to go through. So this is a website called povertyusa.org, and these are some of the facts. So who lives in poverty in the US? So 12.9% of women live in poverty and 10.6% of men live in poverty. Let's look at that by age. Children in poverty. In 2018, 16.2% of children, which is 11.9 million kids, lived in poverty in the US. That's almost 1 in every 6 children. In 2015, the National Center for Family Homelessness analyzed state-level data and found that nationwide, 2.5 million children experience homelessness in a year. Seniors in poverty. Though the official census data gives seniors a 2018 poverty rate of 9.7%, the supplementary poverty measure, which accounts for expenses such as rising costs of healthcare, raises the senior poverty to 14.1%. So let's look at by ethnicity. So 25.4% of Native Americans, 20.8% of Blacks, 17.6% of Hispanics, 10.1% and 10.1% of Asians and white live in poverty. So according to 2018, the census data, the highest poverty rate by race is found amongst Native Americans, as you can see, followed by Blacks, which is the second highest rate, and then Hispanics, and then there's whites and Asians, which account for 10.1% each. So this is the poverty threshold that we just went through. The data that I gave you was from 2019. This is from, I believe, 2015. And you can see that in 2015, it was $12,784 for one person. And now it's $13,300. So we're talking about a raise of just $100 a year, basically. So, again, we're seeing how this rate and the threshold and the numbers that the U.S. government gives us are not the reality of the situation. So let's go back to PowerPoint. So defining and measuring poverty in the U.S. In 1964, the Social Security Administration devised a poverty index based on data that indicated that families spent about 1/3 of their income on food. So the official poverty level was set by multiplying food cost by 3. So that's that number, that $13,300 that I was talking about. So if you were to multiply $370 by 3 and then multiply that number by 12, you'll get in and around $13,300. So that's basically saying that you're going to spend $375 a month on food, $370 a month on food. But then again, you multiply it by 3 and then multiply it by 12, and that's how they get that figure. But is that equation even, again, the reality of the situation? Because we all know that, again, Miami, New York, states, Florida, New York, California, like Washington, D.C., like you cannot find an apartment in many places in the United States for less than $1,900 a month. So again, I can't stress enough how this poverty level and the number that the U.S. government creates is not the reality of the situation. So since then, the poverty level has been updated annually for inflation and differs by the number of the adults and children in a household and by the age of the head of household, but is the same across the continental United States. So that, again, this means that $13,300 It's the same across the board, whether you live in New York, whether you live in California, whether you live in Alabama. And like I showed you before, it does increase, but what you noticed, it increased from 2015 to 2000 to basically a little under $100 a year. And we all know that even now, when you think about the pandemic and you think about how much money the groceries have gone up, I mean, meat alone have gone up 30%. So, I mean, I can't express how this poverty level index and how the numbers set by government is again not the reality of the situation. So Americans are taught that we live a meritocracy, which again that is a term that she introduced in the video, and it's a social system in which individuals get ahead and earn rewards based on their individual efforts and abilities. In a meritocracy, everyone has equal chance to succeed, and it's under that ideology, those who are successful are smart and talented and have worked hard and deserve the success, and those who fail to make it have only themselves to blame. So we do live in a society that's merit based, but when you look at the social institutions, and I'll just pick one, education, we already know off the bat that not everyone has an equal chance to succeed when we look at education. So when we look at schools in impoverished neighborhoods, they're lacking resources, they're lacking extracurricular activities, they're using old books, the schools are falling apart, and they cannot be compared to the schools in many, many rich neighborhoods where they have state of the art everything, whether it's smart boards, whether everybody gets an iPad, whether they have all these different electives to choose from, new textbooks, a building that fosters an environment that students want to learn. So just by looking at the institution of education, we already know that not everyone has an equal chance to succeed. Because if that were true, all schools would mirror each other. There would be, if one school had electives, let's say, for psychology and sociology and all these different types of other things that students may want to learn, they would all have them. It wouldn't just be the rich schools. And if all schools were equal, and everybody had that equal chance to succeed, we would all be having, learning from state-of-the-art technologies, and students will have blackboards or laptops or internet, because there's students that don't even have internet. So when we look at even just this institution of education, it's safe to say that there's no equal there whatsoever. So on to the sociological theories, and the first perspective that we're going to talk about is the structural functionalist. And according to the structural functionalist perspective, poverty results from institutional breakdown, economic institutions that fail to provide sufficient jobs and pay, educational institutions that fail to equip members of society with the skills they need for employment, family institutions that do not provide to parents, and government institutions that do not provide sufficient public support. So here we see how this perspective is specifically looking at the institutions and how they're broken down and how they're insufficient. And number two, when you look at exactly what I said on the slide before, the educational institutions that fail to equip members of society with the skills they need for employment. These institutions are broken. They're not what they need to be. And that's what the structural functionalist perspective is pointing out. Also, from a structural functionalist perspective, economic inequality within a society can be beneficial for society, as a system of unequal pay motivates people to achieve higher levels of training and education and to take on jobs that are more important and difficult by offering higher rewards and higher achievements. And this is true, and we see this happen. If you ask most college students why they're in college, and they're going to say it's because they want to get a high-paying job. So that's what the structural functionalist perspective is saying, that this unequal pay will motivate people to go to college and get a bachelor's degree and get a master's degree, and if you want to get a doctorate degree, just because, it's going to motivate you to get that higher paying position. So the conflict perspective, and we've already mentioned Karl Marx a few times this semester, and he proposed that income inequality results from the domination of the bourgeoisie, which are the owners of factories or the means of production, and over the proletariat, which is the workers. She also mentioned that in her videos. So the bourgeoisie accumulate wealth as they profit from the labor of the proletariat, who earns wages far below the earnings of the bourgeoisie. So modern conflict theories recognize that the power to influence economic outcomes come not only from the ownership of the means of production, but also from management positions, interlocking board memberships, control of media, and financial contributions to politicians. So back to the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. By the time you're watching this video, you're gonna have already have seen the documentary that I've showed in class, and that's basically what that whole documentary is talking about. It's talking about the owners of the factory and the means of production, how they just keep getting richer and richer, and while the workers, the proletariats, are not getting richer. In fact, as you saw in the documentary, um, pay wages have been stagnant since the 1970s. So people are not making any more money. The workers aren't making any more money than they were 40 years ago. And the bourgeoisie, the owners of the factories, are tripling and quadrupling their money. And that's just, and then things are getting more expensive. So there's not even a living wage anymore. So that's basically what that whole documentary that we just finished seeing talked about, and it'll this perspective would work very well with dissecting that documentary. So corporations and the wealthy buy political influence, laws and policies that benefit corporations, such as low interest government loans to failing businesses and special subsidies and tax breaks to corporations, are known as corporate welfare. Free market reform policies benefit wealthy corporations and investors but increase poverty. And welfare are laws and policies that benefit corporations and the wealthy. And again, as we saw in the documentary today, um, we saw how one example is how the rich and the wealthy are taxed at a lower percentage rate than the average middle income worker. So I could be making, $2 million a year, and I'll get taxed 11% of my money. But if I'm making $60,000 a year, I'm going to be taxed 33% of my money. So those are just typical things that are going on where they allow the rich to get richer. So an example of welfare, how laws and policies that benefit corporations and the wealthy. So the symbolic interaction is perspective. Persons who are labeled poor, so remember that the symbolic interaction is perspective, is looking at a micro sociology level. So it looks at people and the interactions of people, and it looks at labels. So persons who are labeled poor are stigmatized as lazy, irresponsible, lacking in motivation, ability, and morals. And wealthy persons are viewed as capable, hardworking, motivated, deserving of wealth. The symbolic interactionist perspective also focuses on the meanings of being poor. In a publication of French economist Thomas Piketty's book Capital in the 21st Century has further increased public awareness of economic inequality as a social problem, and it argues that economic inequality will continue to increase to levels that threaten social stability unless government takes some actions as enforcing a global wealth tax. So, economic inequality, wealth, and poverty in the United States. The United States has the greatest degree of income inequality and the highest rate of poverty of any industrialized nation. So, yes, I'll read it again. So, for those of you guys that may not believe it, but the United States has the greatest degree of income inequality and the highest rate of poverty of any industrialized nation. In 2012, the wealthiest 1% of the U.S. households earned more than 22.5% of the nation's income. And the top 10% of income earners took home more than half of the nation's total income. So a lot of this was talked about in the documentary that you guys saw. So this is just basically reiterating that information. So in 2014, CEOs at the top 350 US corporations received in salaries and other compensation, such as bonuses and stocks, an average of 303 times the average compensation of US workers. That means that a typical worker would have to work 303 years to earn what a CEO made in 1 year. So, patterns in poverty in the United States. So, first is age and poverty. So, as we saw in the website that I showed you, a lot of children are living in poverty and a lot of elderly are living in poverty. And in 2014, 46.7 million Americans, which is 14.8% of the US population, lived below the poverty line. And remember, the poverty line was the one person 13,300, family of four was 26,000 basically. So that's where these numbers are coming from. And like I said, those numbers are skewed, they're wrong, it's not the reality. So I would say that more people are living in poverty than what these numbers are saying. About a third of US children experience poverty for at least part of their childhood, and 10% of children are persistently poor, spending at least half of their childhood living in poverty. Compared with other industrialized countries, the United States has the highest child poverty rate. Again, compared to with other industrialized countries, the United States has the highest child poverty rate. So here it says that children are more likely than adults to live in poverty. So when people say those in the poor are lazy or they just don't want to work, they're not realizing that many of the people living in poverty can't work. Children can't work, and many of the elderly can't work. So, in fact, the vast majority of the people living in poverty, it's not that they don't want to work, it's just that they cannot work. So here's a look at a graph. 21.1% younger than 18, 13.5% are 18 to 64, and 10% are 65 and older. This is basically the age range of people living in poverty. So, sex and poverty. Women are more likely than men to live below the poverty line, a phenomenon referred to as the feminization of poverty. And as we saw on that website, I showed you that women are, what was it, like 12.5%, and men were around 10%. And in 2014, 16.1% of women and 13.4% of men were living below the poverty line. So those were the numbers in 2014. As you saw, I showed you numbers from 2019. So they have dropped a little bit. But again, we're talking about the poverty line that the government has created and those numbers that they have come up with, which are not the reality. So, education and poverty. Education is one of the best insurance policies for protecting an individual against living in poverty. In general, the higher a person's level of educational attainment, the less likely that person is to be poor. So, family structure and poverty. Poverty is much more prevalent among female headed single parent households than among other types of family structures. In other industrialized countries, poverty rates of female headed families are lower than those in the United States. So, again, here we see how the United States has extremely high numbers of people living in poverty, and how, once again, in this example, a one parent home with just a mother is much more prevalent to be living in poverty than a male single parent living with his children. So here is a graph, and it shows you a family structure in poverty. So it shows you married couple and family, 6.2% are living in poverty. A female householder with no spouse present is 30.6% of them are living in poverty, and male householder with no spouse present, 15.7% are living in poverty. So race and ethnicity and poverty. Poverty rates are higher among blacks, Hispanics, and Asians than among non-Hispanic whites. Past and present discrimination has contributed to the persistence of poverty among minorities. So a perfect example of that statement of past and present discrimination has contributed to is the practice of redlining since the 1930s, and how many people, many black people specifically, were not given home loans to buy houses, and not giving them the opportunity to create wealth. Um, there has been some studies and some investigations that now, I mean, redlining has been illegal since the late 60s, but I mean, now it's a different form of redlining, if you will. So now let's take a white family and a black family, and both families make the same amount of money. Both families have the same credit score. Both families, they're identical in every shape, form. The only difference is their race. And both of these families go to the bank to get out a loan. There is a high percentage of black families getting a higher mortgage rate on their loan, an interest rate on their loan, when you compare to the white counterparts. So let's say a white family gets a loan for the 200,000 to buy the house, and they get an interest rate of, let's say, 4% or 6%, depending on where we are in society. Right now, you could probably get a loan for 3%. Black families would then get a loan. So let's say the white family got 5, the black family got 8%. Or let's say the white family got 3% because that's what the rate was going. The black family was looking at paying a 5% interest rate. So this is just another example of now why does a black family have to pay more on a mortgage than the white family? Again, just policies that continue to marginalize different types of communities. So other contributing factors include the loss of manufacturing jobs from the inner city, the movement of whites and middle-class blacks out of the inner city, and the resulting concentration of poverty in predominantly minority inner city neighborhoods. So another reason why, well, let me just continue. We'll go to the next slide. Let's see. So here is the graph. So we're looking at poverty rates by race and Hispanics. So black or African Americans are looking at 27.6%, which is disproportionate because the United States has between 13 and 14% of its residents are black or African American. So it just goes to show that when we say 27% of, it's just disproportionate to when we look at the statistical figures of who represents the United States. So white non-Hispanic are at 11%, Hispanic and Latino are at 24%, Asian are at 12%, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander are at 20%, American Indian are at 28%, or 2 or more races are at 20.4%. So labor force participation and poverty. A common image of the poor is that they are jobless and unable or unwilling to work. Although the poor in the United States are primarily children and adults who are not in the labor force, many U.S. poor are classified as working poor, which are individuals who spend at least 27 weeks per year in the labor force, or they're either working or looking for work, but whose income falls below the official poverty level. So again, we tend to stereotype the poor as lazy and they don't want to work, but it is clear that the poor in the United States are primarily children and adults who are not even able to work. So consequences of economic inequality and poverty. So health problems, hunger, and poverty. In the United States, low socioeconomic status is associated with higher incidence and prevalence of health problems, disease, and death. Hunger in the United States is measured by the percentage of households that are food insecure, which means that the household had difficulty providing enough food for all its members due to a lack of resources. In 2013, nearly 14% of U.S. households were food insecure at some time during the year. So another consequence is substandard housing and homelessness. Substandard housing is many times the poor live in homes that have a list of problems, whether it's the roof could be caving in, leaky roofs, holes on the floor, open cracks in the walls. They lack central heating and air conditioning. They lack adequate sewer and septic systems and electrical outlets, and often located in areas with high crime rates and high levels of pollution. Homelessness. Due to the recent rise in unemployment and foreclosures, more women, men, and children have been pushed into homelessness. The number of homeless nationwide is estimated to be more than 1 million. Over the course of a lifetime, an estimated 9% to 15% of the US population becomes homeless. And there's a term called couch homeless, which are individuals who do not have a home of their own and who stay at the home of family and friends. So, speaking about homelessness and foreclosure, I would imagine that now, when we look at the pandemic and everything that's going on with the coronavirus and people not being able to pay rent and paying mortgages in their house, I do believe that in the next few months we're going to be hearing stories, and I'm sure that you guys are going to see them all over social media, of many people that are going to lose their homes due because they can't pay their mortgage, and many people getting kicked out of their apartments because they can't pay their rent because it's just going to be too much. We're in a situation now that is testing this. So I would imagine that we're going to see a huge problem in homelessness in the next few months. So, legal inequality. In 1963, the Supreme Court ruled in Gideon versus Wainwright that criminal defendants who cannot afford to hire an attorney have the constitutional right to a public defense. Without the resource for effective legal representation, poor defendants often accept unfair plea bargains, and the systemic result is harsher outcomes for defendants and more people tangled in our costly criminal justice system. So, what the fact that it's great that everybody has the right to get a free public defense, we also know that it's not a great system because many of these public defenders are overseeing so many cases that they can't even create a relationship with their clients. They can't successfully have time to study what the case is all about, and come up with a good defense. Like this system, though it's good, it is lacking um, what it should be doing. There's just not enough public defenders for people right now in the court system that can't afford lawyers. So political inequality and alienation. The wealthy have greater access to politicians and to media and can communicate their point of view and interest, often masquerading as national interest much more effectively than the rest of us. In 2010, the Supreme Court ruling in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission that allows corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money to support or oppose political candidates has contributed to political inequality. And we see this with big pharma. We see this with the tobacco corporations. They all have their hands in politics and donations, and that's why we have these laws that are kind of catered to them, if you will. Uh, so that's basically what this is talking about. So crime, social conflict, and war. Poverty and economic inequality are linked to crime and violence. Economic inequality and poverty are often root causes of conflict and war within and between nations. Poor countries are more likely than wealthier countries to be involved in civil war, and countries that experience civil war tend to become and or remain poor. So natural disasters, economic inequality, and poverty. So although natural disasters such as hurricanes, tsunamis, floods, and earthquakes strike indiscriminately, rich and poor alike, poverty increases vulnerability to devastations from such disasters. But even in wealthy countries, the poor are more vulnerable to natural disasters, while the more affluent have resources that enable them to cope with natural disasters. So we saw this. Let's bring back the example of the pandemic and when you guys did in week 2 the coronavirus and race, and how blacks were being disproportionately affected than any other group, and a lot of it had to do with poverty and not being able to access Medicare or health insurance rather, and going to the hospital and not being believed or whatever the case may be. But we see how natural disasters, we can argue whether the pandemic was natural or not, but I mean we could keep it under the umbrella of natural disasters, do affect those living in poverty more than the wealthy. Again, we're going to see a lot of people that are going to, like I said 5 minutes ago, we're going to see a lot of people that the next few months that are going to end up homeless because many people are living paycheck to paycheck. There not many people are like the wealthy that have a savings account where for times like this where they don't need to work and they have some sort of reserve in the savings account that can pay their their bills for the next few months, and the vast majority of Americans don't have that. So that's how a natural disaster, such as a hurricane, a pandemic, or even an earthquake or flood, can affect those living in poverty more than the wealthy. So educational problems and poverty. In many countries, children from the poorest households have little or no schooling and enter their adult lives without basic literary skills. In the United States, children living in poverty are more likely to suffer academically than are children who are not poor. And some of these examples could be self-explanatory. Poor families not going to be able to afford a tutor. You know, like I said earlier, when you live in poor communities, the schools are just not up to par. They're not up to um, the way they should be when we compare them to wealthy schools. So there's different examples as to why children in poverty tend to suffer academically, but it can be as far as poor nutrition, poor sleep, not having a stable home. These children and these students have other things to deal with that when they get to school, they just don't want to deal, and because they're dealing with these life affecting problems that children shouldn't have to be dealing with. So the poor often attend schools that are characterized by lower quality facilities, overcrowded classrooms, and a higher teacher turnover rate. So just exactly what I had said in the previous slide and before. These schools are not the way they should be. Children who grow up in poverty suffer mental health problems that contribute to their lower academic achievement. And with the skyrocketing cost of tuition and other fees, many poor parents can't afford to send their children to college. And like you guys saw in the documentary before watching this pre-recorded video, we saw how Berkeley College was free at one point, then it was $700 a year, and now it's, if you live in the state, it's $15,000 a year. So, and as I stated earlier, people are making the same amount of money that they were making 20, 30 years ago. The minimum wage has gone up, but not to the same amount as the inflation of everything else that has gone up. In the 80s, yeah, you could have rented an apartment for $600 a month, and what you were getting paid minimum wage would have could have been enough. But nowadays, making $8 an hour or $9 an hour, whatever the minimum wage is in whatever state, there's some states that are giving $15 an hour now. But minimum wage is not living wage in the society that we live in, and how things are expensive. Whether it's the food, whether it's your car, whether it's where you live. You cannot live off of minimum wage. So marriage opportunity gap and family problems associated with poverty and income inequality. So poverty and income inequality creates a marriage opportunity gap. In lower income households, marriage rates are low. Divorce non-marital childbearing rates are high. So again, in lower income households, marriage rates are low and divorce and non-marital childbearing rates are high. The stresses associated with low income contribute to substance abuse, domestic violence, child abuse and neglect, divorce, and questionable parenting practices. Poor adolescent teenagers are at a higher risk of having babies than their non-poor peers. So intergenerational poverty, problems associated with poverty such as health and educational problems, create a cycle of poverty from one generation to the next. Poverty that is transmitted from one generation to the next is called intergenerational poverty. Intergenerational poverty creates a persistently poor and socially disadvantaged population referred to as the underclass. So, one example of intergenerational poverty, and let's use the example of race and redlining. Um, since the 1930s, like I said earlier, up until the late 1960s, um, blacks were redlined. They couldn't get loans. They couldn't acquire a home and build wealth. And they were stuck in this cycle of poverty because the government and laws and policies weren't allow them to acquire wealth, which in turn perpetuated intergenerational poverty. So strategies for action. There's international response to poverty and economic inequality. In 2000, leaders from 191 United Nations member countries pledged to achieve 8 Millennium Development Goals, an international agenda for reducing poverty and improving lives. One of the Millennium Development Goals was to have, between 1990 and 2015, the proportion of people who live in severe poverty and who suffer from hunger. Another strategy is taxes on the wealthy. So Oxfam calculated that adding a 1.5% tax on the world's billionaires could raise $74 billion in tax revenue, enough to fill the annual gaps in funding needed to provide education to every child and deliver healthcare services to the poorest 49 countries. And in 2013, the world lost an estimated $156 billion in tax revenue due to wealthy individuals hiding their money in offshore tax havens. So this is something like, what you hear Bernie Sanders would say, that we need to tax the extreme rich at a higher rate so that we could subsidize and fill in the gaps to all these underfunded institutions like education. So economic development policies that involve cutting government spending, privatizing basic services, liberalizing trade, and producing goods primarily for export may increase economic growth at the national level, but the wealth ends up at the hands of the political and corporate elite at the expense of the poor. Another problem with economic development is that the environment and natural resources are often destroyed and depleted in the process of economic growth. So human development. Unlike economic development approach to poverty alleviation, the human development approach views people, not money, as the real wealth of the nation. Investments in human development involves programs and policies that provide adequate nutrition, sanitation, housing, healthcare, which include reproductive healthcare and family planning, and educational and job training. So this would be the idea, rather than doing economic development, to do human development. And this is kind of like now when we're hearing, defund the police, which doesn't really mean defund the police. It just means to not fund them as much as we do. And so the defund the police idea is to, let's say, the police station for this state, they're granting them $150 million in money. So now the state is deciding not to give them 150 million. Let's just give them 75 million, and we'll use now the other 75 million on programs, that are gonna help reduce number one, poverty, number two, mental health issues. So this is basically that human development idea, that we can kind of see it with this whole defund the police notion. So there's also microcredit programs, which refer to the provision of loans to people who are generally excluded from traditional credit services because of their low socioeconomic status. The Agreement Bank in Bangladesh, started in 1976, has become a model for more than 3,000 microcredit programs that have served millions of poor clients. So this is just basically a way to get a loan to people who would otherwise would be not be able to get a loan at their bank. So, reducing U.S. poverty and economic inequality. An important area for reducing economic inequality involves improving the quality and equality of healthcare and education. A number of tax reforms could also help reduce economic inequality. Progressive taxes are those in which the tax rate increase as income increases, so that those who have higher incomes are taxed at higher rates. So back to that notion that the wealthy are taxed at a lower rate than those living in either poverty or medium incomes, middle incomes, and as you saw spoken about in the documentary before this pre-recorded video. So I mentioned living wage and minimum wage. So there's idea to increase minimum wage to living wage. So in 2015, the federal minimum wage was $7.25 an hour. I believe now it's like 8 something. Some states have established a minimum wage that is higher than the federal minimum wage. So yeah, there are some states that, because the federal is 8 something, but there are some states that do 10. There are some states like in California, San Francisco is doing 15 an hour. So Senator Tom Harkin and Congressman George Miller proposed the Fair Minimum Wage Act in 2013, which if passed would raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10.10 over a period of 3 years, and would then be raised automatically each year based on inflation. So there is a lot of talk about this. I think a lot of states are going to be moving into that $15 an hour minimum wage. I know that some people take issue on that, but at the end of the day, we need to start realizing that people need to make a living wage and not a minimum wage, because just because you work at a McDonald's doesn't mean that you shouldn't be worthy of being able to rent an apartment and eat and drive to work. And these are quote unquote essential workers, and we love these essential workers now, because without them, who's going to deliver while we were in lockdown? Who was going to deliver food? Who was going to open up and work at Publix? And all these people are making less than $15 an hour. And now these are the people that we depend on. So it is important that we fight for living wage for these individuals. So there are different safety nets. One of the safety nets are public assistance and welfare programs in the United States. So various public assistance or welfare programs in the United States are aimed at providing a safety net for adults and children who are deemed eligible to receive such assistance. A means-tested program is one that has eligibility requirements based on income and/or assets. So public assistance programs designed to help the poor include supplemental security income, temporary assistance for needy families, food programs, housing assistance, medical care such as Medicaid, educational assistance, child care, and the Earned Income Tax Credit. So here's some myths and realities about welfare. So myth number 1 is that people receiving welfare are lazy. And that is not true, because the reality is that most recipients of TANF and SNAP benefits are children, and therefore are not expected to work, so they can't be lazy. And more than 1 in 10 TANF families have earned incomes from employment, but with average monthly earnings of only $838, which they cannot survive on, the income from their jobs. So obviously, if they're working, they're not lazy. They just can't survive on this minimum wage, rather than being afforded the opportunity to make a living wage. Myth number 2 is that most welfare mothers have many children, and that is not true. In 2011, the average number of children in families that received the TANF was only 1.8. And this is not to say they had 1 child and a 0.8 child. When we look at these numbers and statistics, we have to divide it, and it's 1.8, so that means that between 1 and 2 children. So half of the families receiving TANF had only 1 child, and less than 8% of the families had more than 3 children. Another myth is that welfare benefits are granted to many people who are not really poor or eligible to receive them. That is not true. The reality is that although some people obtain welfare benefits through fraudulent means, it is much more common for people who are eligible to receive welfare to receive welfare, not to receive the benefits. So this is just basically saying, so yeah, fraudulent means happen. People do scam the system, that does exist, but the vast majority, and it's much more common for people who are eligible to receive welfare, end up not receiving any of the benefits. That's more common than anybody trying to cheat the system. A main reason for not receiving benefits is lack of information. People do not know that they are eligible. Another myth is there's a widespread abuse of fraud in SNAP by beneficiaries who use their food stamps benefits to purchase beer, wine, liquor, cigarettes, and/or tobacco, or who sell their food stamps benefits for cash. So that's another myth, because there is not widespread abuse. The Government Accountability Office found that trafficking, which is selling the SNAP benefits for cash, decreased from 3.8 cents per dollar of benefits in 1993 to about 1 cent per dollar of benefits in 2010. So, though you may hear of people selling their SNAP cards or selling their food stamps and their benefits, and though that may happen, it's not a widespread problem, number one. And number two, at the end of the day, if if I had food stamps, right, and I was working and I got paid my money and I saw that my refrigerator was full for the week, and I needed $200 to pay my rent, I don't know if I wouldn't sell my benefits. And I don't know if we can look down upon that, because at the end of the day, I mean, people are going to do what they have to do to survive. So when you hear somebody, oh, they're just selling their benefits and to make money, whatever, I'm like, yeah, maybe they are, but we can't automatically assume that they're selling it so they can go out and party. I think it's safe to assume that many people that are selling it would be using it because they need that cash to pay for other things, other necessities, and other bills. Another myth is that immigrants place a huge burden on our welfare system, and that's a lie. Low-income non-citizen immigrants, including adults and children, are less likely to receive public benefits than those who are native-born. So finally, understanding economic inequality and wealth and poverty. Blaming poverty on the individual rather than on the structural and cultural factors implies not only that the poor individuals are responsible for their plight, but also that they are responsible for improving their condition. Ending or reducing poverty begins with the recognition that doing so is a worthy ideal and attainable goal. Efforts to alleviate poverty are often motivated by a sense of moral responsibility. So, that concludes the PowerPoint. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or text me. So now it's time to take your quiz. So take the quiz and good luck.